have to use the word exactly the way I think that it deserves to be used, one of the most notorious professional wrestlers in the world. I might add a few more things. He's the European champ, although he does not wrestle in Europe anymore. Now, there's some strange, interesting things and stories about our introduction of our special guest today. So without any further ado, out here with Jimmy Hart, I would like to introduce the European champ, Baron von Krupp.
It's Killer Karl Krupp. Mr. Hart has sent me a telegram, Mr. Russell, asking for help. Well, I came. You will know who I am. You will understand in short order why I am here. In very short order, you will not be able to sleep.
And his opponent from Germany, 256 pounds, Baron von Krupp. It is so true, ladies and gentlemen.
Few wrestlers in history managed to blur the line between performance and persona as convincingly as Killer Karl Krupp. Emerging from the smoky arenas of the 1970s territorial circuit, Krupp wasn't just another villain. He was the embodiment of post-war fear, propaganda, and theater. With his shaved head, manic eyes, and guttural accent, Krupp strutted to the ring as a caricature of German militarism, sneering at audiences who hissed and booed as though he had truly crawled out of the rubble of World War II. But behind the spectacle was George Momberg, a Dutch-born man who had once lived through the Nazi occupation of his homeland. That irony, that a man victimized by war would later become one of wrestling's most convincing German villains, adds a strange, almost tragic depth to his legacy. In the pantheon of wrestling heels, Killer Karl Krupp represents more than just a character. He symbolizes a time when wrestling's morality plays reflected the cultural anxieties of their audiences. His exaggerated villainy wasn't simply about winning or losing, it was about channeling national memory, fear, and catharsis through performance. George Momberg's story begins far from the wrestling rings that would one day make him infamous. Born on May 13, 1934, in Holland, Momberg grew up during one of the darkest periods in modern history. His childhood was shaped by the hardships of World War II, a time when survival meant resilience, and the concept of villains and heroes was anything but theatrical. In 1949, his father left for Canada to find a better life, working on a farm in Ilderton, Ontario, a small community just outside London. 2 years later, with the help of the Canadian government, the rest of the Momberg family followed, starting over in a new country built on promise and labor. Originally a soccer player, George soon discovered his passion for amateur wrestling, a sport that combined discipline and physical artistry in equal measure. Like many who came out of Hamilton, Ontario, Momberg spent his days working in the steel mills and his nights training at the Hamilton Jewish Center and YMCA. It was a crucible of sweat and steel, where future legends honed their craft under the watchful eye of local trainers. Among them was Jack Wentworth, who officially trained Momberg and guided him toward the world of professional wrestling. In 1957, he made his debut as the Flying Dutchman, Dutch Momberg, a far cry from the menacing persona that would later define his career. But as the wrestling landscape evolved in the 1960s and 1970s, an era obsessed with clear moral divides and theatrical villains, Momberg's early identity as a clean-cut athlete couldn't compete with the spectacle audiences craved, and he needed to do something different. The reinvention came in late 1971. After years of wrestling under various names and struggling to find a distinctive persona, George Momberg emerged in Stampede Wrestling as Killer Karl Krupp, a name that would define the rest of his career. The newly christened Krupp was impossible to ignore. He marched to the ring with a sadistic grin plastered across his face, clutching a riding crop in one hand and peering through a monocle like a caricature of military authority. His head was either shaved or cut into a severe brush, and his voice boomed with a thick, guttural accent that made the character feel pulled straight from a war film. Everything about the presentation was designed to provoke. The sneer, the mannerisms, the mock discipline, all of it fused into a single image of theatrical villainy. The gimmick wasn't just about being German. It was about embodying a villain so completely that people forgot the man behind the act. And once the costume was on, there was no turning back. Like many of the German heel characters that came before him, Krupp relied on a signature weapon, the Iron Claw, a hold where he pressed his hand against an opponent's face or skull until they appeared to crumble beneath the pressure. The move had already been made famous by Fritz von Erich, and Krupp would later join forces with von Erich in Japan as the Iron Claw Masters, a pairing that turned menace into myth. Together, they represented a specific kind of wrestling storytelling that blurred national history into performance, exploiting real-world tensions for crowd reactions. Audiences despised Krupp, and that hatred was precisely the point. Every time he strutted into the ring, barking orders in a mock German accent or sneering at the Canadian and American crowds, he gave them a safe outlet for the fears and anger that still lingered from the war. Killer Karl Krupp wasn't just a character. It was an act of cultural theater. Through him, George Momberg had transformed himself from a Dutch immigrant who lived through wartime occupation into one of the most convincing villains of wrestling's territorial era. In doing so, he tapped into something deeply human about performance, the desire to confront evil, not in reality, but in spectacle, where the boos are cathartic and the bad guy always, eventually, gets what's coming. Despite the success, the man behind the monocle carried complicated feelings about the character he'd created. The performance that made George Momberg famous also carried an uncomfortable irony, one that never sat entirely right with him. His brother, Hank Momberg, later reflected that George didn't love the gimmick, even if he came to embody it. It really irked him, Hank said. Being Dutch and having gone through the war years, he took more like the First World War type German, with the monocle and all. He didn't want to get involved with Nazism at all. It was more of a German from the First World War. That distinction between the monstrous imagery of the Second World War and the exaggerated militarism of the First was crucial to how Momberg saw himself in the role. Yet audiences, still steeped in post-war imagery, couldn't separate one from the other. To them, Krupp was the embodiment of the German menace, the snarling face of an old enemy made flesh again in the squared circle. For all the discomfort George Momberg felt about the character, Killer Karl Krupp became one of the most recognizable and successful villains of wrestling's territorial era. His act transcended regions and borders, bringing him notoriety across Canada, the United States, and Japan. In the 1970s, Krupp became a major draw for Stampede Wrestling, where his menacing persona regularly headlined cards and fueled storylines that drew some of the most passionate crowd reactions in the promotion's history. His ability to generate genuine outrage from fans, sometimes requiring police escorts to leave the arena, was considered a mark of success in an era when the crowd's hatred was proof that the illusion was working. Krupp's reputation soon carried him south into the American territories, where he became a fixture in Florida Championship Wrestling, Memphis, and the Amarillo Territory in Texas. In Florida, under the direction of promoter Eddie Graham, Krupp captured the Florida Heavyweight Championship and established himself as a top heel, regularly facing off against local heroes like Dusty Rhodes. His brutal style, deliberate pacing, and signature Iron Claw finisher made him a believable threat to any territory's leading babyface. By the late 1970s, Killer Karl Krupp had built a career that spanned continents and captured the spirit of wrestling's most vivid era. He won championships, headlined main events, and became a name known to anyone who followed the sport. Krupp's success in Japan, however, also marked the beginning of the end for George Momberg. During one of his tours there, his brother Hank later recalled he contracted hepatitis A, an illness that would quietly shadow him for the rest of his life. After years of grueling travel, physical punishment, and embodying a character that demanded so much intensity, Momberg's time in the ring began to wane. He eventually settled into a quieter life away from wrestling, taking steady work as a truck driver for Day and Ross in Canada. Though he had largely stepped away from the business, his old friend and promoter Emile Dupré would occasionally lure him back for summer shows, brief returns that reminded fans of the menacing charisma that had once filled arenas. Despite those fleeting comebacks, the damage was done. On August 24, 1995, George Momberg died in Moncton, New Brunswick, from complications related to the hepatitis he had contracted years earlier while wrestling in Japan. His passing marked the end of a life spent in constant transformation, from a Dutch immigrant rebuilding after war, to a steel worker in Hamilton, to one of wrestling's most unforgettable villains. Though his final years were lived far from the spotlight, Momberg's legacy as Killer Karl Krupp remains an essential part of wrestling history. His career serves as both a cautionary tale and a tribute to the physical and emotional cost of performance. Krupp was the kind of villain that defined an era, loud, controversial, and completely committed to the role. In the end, the story of Killer Karl Krupp is really the story of George Momberg, a man who survived war, reinvented himself across continents, and then stepped into a role that asked him to become the very villain he once feared. His career was built on spectacle, but his life was marked by quiet resilience, from the steel mills of Hamilton to the long roads he traveled as a truck driver in his final years. Even now, Krupp remains one of wrestling's most unforgettable creations, a character so vivid he threatened to eclipse the man behind him. But it was Momberg's humanity, his discipline, his discomfort, his total commitment to the craft that made the monster believable.